We are no historians, but to dive into history through the words of a poet from the past, as we're doing with Shakespeare, involves at least an appreciation of history. That's doubly true when it comes to Shakespeare's history plays, which were themselves interpretations of historical facts and records reimagined for Shakespeare's contemporary audience. Shakespeare took what he and his audience thought to be true from the past and wove tales together to make sense of that past for the benefit of the present. And we all do that with the past too. Now, for most of us, by and large, the sense of history most of us inherit is based on ages and eras and big concepts like that. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Medieval Age, the Renaissance era, and so on and so forth. And that general grouping of time into distinct periods recognizable by certain features is always bound to fall apart at one point or another. When you're trying to sum up the entirety of a human society in a particular point of time and space, the categories we use to understand one period as distinct from another, inevitably start to fall apart. For English history, at least, that period of gradual change from the medieval era, the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, to the early modern or the Renaissance period of England that we talk about so much on this podcast, has a neat little overlay. The 100 Years' War, that war between the English and French nobles for the crown of France, saw a huge change in many facets of life on both sides, but especially in England. Some elements of the society that we commonly identify as medieval were already falling apart or already in disarray, while others that we identify as Renaissance were already starting to take hold. Today, to help illuminate a bit of the history as Shakespeare saw it, we're looking at the same period of history as we now understand it. We'll hopefully get a sense of the changes that affected over 5 generations of English monarchs and millions of nobles, peasants, and soldiers who all fought in this long, grueling war.
Since brevity is the soul of wit.
More of your conversation would infect my brain.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
To speak of him as my kinsman, he's a most notable coward, an infinite and endless liar, an hourly promise breaker, the owner of no one good quality worthy your lordship's entertainment.
I'd beat thee, but I should infect my hand.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
And if that speech was too long and grueling and you're not interested, you should probably bow now, because we are here to talk about the 100 Years' War, Lindsay.
We are. The 100 Years' War misnomered.
Yes.
It actually lasted
terribly.
about 116 years or so.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, was it battle after battle after battle right after the other? Were they fighting continually?
No, not even close.
Kind of like the Wars of the Roses, where it was like periods of war interrupting long stretches of peace.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was a really great opening, and I like the way, Aiden, that you mentioned that we're going to be talking about eras and ages, and we've already done that. But to get a sense of the broad sweep of history in terms of these neat, discrete chunks is kind of it's for our benefit as readers and thinkers and historians today. But history is never really that neat, except right here, where it kind of does usher in an early modern era in Western, in England and France. So Canada is a beneficiary of both of those, and the United States as well to a degree. So, I mean, this is important for us as in Western society. So, I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, and it is an interesting period for. I mean, the conflicts themselves are complicated and kind of arcane by today's standards, but they're also very simple to understand. It was, I want that crown. I should be the king of France. And they're like, no, I should be the king of France. And that was it. And that just that argument lasted 116 years. And it's kind of crazy that it continued. And that the crown actually changed hands at a couple points, which is also crazy.
Well, and I mean, it just bleeds into this longer English sense of inferiority compared to the French, because the English really were the French for a very long time, from the Norman conquest all the way up through the Plantagenets and I guess right on to the Tudors. They really were the inheritors of French culture. And so and as we've learned with kings like Henry VI, who actually was the king of France for a time. This is a very messy tale of houses and dynasties that kind of bleed into one another.
But we're gonna keep it kind of simple.
Hopefully.
And, I mean, honestly, if you want like dates and details and stuff like that, we're not going to be great at providing that.
No, but there are lots of places where you can find
Yes.
that, and we will link to them in our podcast landing page.
Even just the Wikipedia entry on the 100 Years' War is a fine starting off point. There's a couple of good documentaries Lindsay watched on YouTube. There's no shortage of information on this topic, but we kind of wanted to take a look at some of the bigger themes and how they kind of led into Shakespeare's time and the plays he wrote about this time period. We just read Henry VI Part 1, but I mean the 100 Years' War was going on during Richard II, also a Shakespeare play. Henry IV and V. Also, three Shakespeare
starts with
plays.
Edward III, which is where our Wars of the Roses discussion began way back when.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but we are looking at it through the lens of how this impacted the writing of the history plays as Shakespeare, and the histories as Shakespeare understood them, and that his sources understood, Holland's Head and others. Yeah. So, and I should preface this by saying that I know very little about this time period. It's been a busy time for me at work, and I didn't have as much time to devote to this. So the teacher has become the student.
Isn't that
Aiden is going
convenient?
to be the pedagogue at the front of the class, and I will try not to literally throw spitballs.
No, if you need to,
at
go
his
right
head.
ahead,
But
because unlike you, I don't know what I'm talking about.
no, I do think you do, and I'm not shooting you down. I'm saying that I have. Aiden, you read a novel, or sorry, not a novel, but a very large historical.
It was actually a short.
text.
There was a great series on the 100 Years' War, a 5-part one, each book about 600 pages.
Wow.
I was like, I could dive into that, but I didn't. I went for an abbreviated history of the 100 Years' War. I think that's actually what it's called. If not, we'll post up the link to that book as well that I did read. It was a very good short history. It was very factual, but it also dove into some of the themes and cultural changes, I would say, that we're going to discuss here today. But to give that brief, short, introductory kind of history, it all goes back to William I, as most things do in England.
Yes, let's
politically.
make things short and go back to 1066.
So in 1066, William I, when he became King of England, didn't stop being the Duke of Normandy.
Right.
And he still ostensibly owed vassalage to King...
Is that a word, teacher? Vassalage? Did you
Yes.
just make up a word?
No. Again, if you'd played Crusader Kings 2, Lindsay, you would know these words backwards and forwards. Anyways, he owed allegiance. He bent the knee to go back. Oh, yeah, we're not going to go there. But he owed allegiance to the French king. And so did his descendants through on time. At one point, the end of an empire, Henry II had, the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is a huge part of southern France, as well as Normandy and parts of Anjou and other areas in like the Midlands of France. At one point, the English monarchs had owned more of France than any French nobles. Not even close, right? And so this went back and forth over time. Lands would get inherited or taken over in a war.
Marriages would happen. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the wealthiest landowners.
Exactly, and that's where Henry II got his lands from, right? And then, bad kings like King John would lose them in wars and so on and so forth. But this really kind of came to a head in 1328. King Charles V of France dies. And he doesn't have a direct heir. So there's multiple
So he had no
options.
children, or he had...
I don't remember. I think he did have children.
But they were illegitimate or something?
Yeah, I think it was something like that. So they weren't
Typical French.
Exactly.
I'm just kidding.
Again, that's the Canadian in us. Just we always poke fun at the French. That's
I
how
am
we
French.
do. Yeah, I know.
I'm allowed to do this. It's who I am.
And
My Quebecois
how are your
blood.
French skills, Lindsay?
C'est bon. That's not even the
not
right
good
way
at
to
all.
answer that question.
Anyways, the two main complainants to this, one was on the English side, Edward III, the current king of England. I think he inherited it from his mother, was a princess of France.
Yes.
And so he thought, oh, well, I'm going to be definitely the king of France. That's how it should work. Of course, in French law, women really couldn't inherit, a chicken coop, let alone, a kingdom. So really, he didn't really have much of a legal leg to stand on, but none of that mattered. In any case, the other one on the French side was Philip of Valois. And so he's founded
the Valois.
The Valois. After the Capetian, this was Charles V was the kind of last of the Capetians, I believe, and the Valois came over, and they basically ruled for a couple hundred years.
Aren't there
I believe.
Capetian descendants in the quote unquote royal families of many other?
Yes, they also continue.
Spain.
Well, and the
Capetian
Valois
blood?
is just considered a cadet family. Again, if you played Crusader Kings 2, Lindsay, I could explain this to you by when they take over the war and the female heir comes in. Anyways, there's many complicated things about this, but these were the two main players for this initial start of the war.
Philip and Edward. Gotcha.
So Edward III was already a vassal of Charles V when Charles V died, because he still had some lands in France.
Gascony, right?
Yeah,
I think that was it.
Guyenne, and the County of Ponthieu, which is I think one of the Channel Islands. It's like a tiny little estate.
Right.
And Charles was like, no, I'm gonna take over the crown. Instead of paying you homage, you should pay me homage for your lands that I legitimately recognized from you. And by 1337, the war was underway. And that was it. After that, it just took on a life of its own, because even after both of those men had died, the claim over who owned the Kingdom of France continued. And in some respects, it stopped being, for long periods of time, it wasn't so much about someone taking over the crown so much as it was just an excuse to go kill people and start wars and rape and pillage and so forth.
Really? You mean there was a medieval military industrial complex?
Lindsay, you have no idea. The truth bombs I'm about to drop on you will explode your mind.
You should see the shock and awe on my face.
It is a tale told by an idiot. It's full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
So, as we mentioned, 100 years of intermittent warfare, and defined, and as I just said to Lindsay, in many cases by pillaging, not so much huge tracts of land changing hands or anything like that. It was literally just the English
come in, burn the shit out of everything.
Exactly, and then take away all the booty they could and head back to England.
Right.
And there were many famous battles. Of which England actually won quite a few, which is one of the turning points of the historical period.
Can I ask why England was so successful? Is that something you're going to get into?
Yes, in fact, right away.
Okay, great.
But eventually, just to ruin the ending, first of all, though, France wins the 100 Years' War, obviously.
Boo. I knew that.
I mean, they kind of lost it, but then they won it in the end, so it all worked out. Go Joan of Arc. So there were, just to go over some of the famous battles, because we might mention them here and there. There was Crécy. Again, butchering all the French names, I'm sure.
That sounds about right.
1346. That was the battle that kind of established England as a military power, because up until this point, France was the dominant military power in Western Europe, probably most of Europe as it stood.
All those chevaliers.
Exactly.
Right?
They were the masters of the knighthood and the horse charge, the mailed knights on huge horses, mowing down the opposition with their giant battle formations and so forth. And England came along with these little small guys with bows from the Welsh woods, and all of a sudden they could kill hundreds of these.
Are we talking the longbows now?
Yes. So the English longbow really changed the course of the war for everybody, but especially for England in this time period, because between that battle and also the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where King John, who was, I think, Philip's son, was captured by the English in 1356.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And then he eventually died, actually, in the Tower of London.
Years later, right?
Yeah, and it's a crazy story, because he was captured at this battle. They agreed on a ransom. France paid some of the ransom, like a down payment, got him back, and then when they couldn't pay more, he voluntarily returned to London. Yes.
Oh my God.
This is real, because their code of chivalry demanded that he honor his agreement that was made.
That's
so he went back to London,
What?
and he died there.
Oh my God.
Yes, I mean, I think he died fairly shortly after he came back. It's not like he languished there for
well, and I'm
decades
sure
again,
as the son of a king, he probably wasn't, in chains in the dungeon.
No, apparently they threw a big party for him when he came back. It's like, hey, you're back!
Right
and then
on!
He died.
Oh my God, that's insane. I had no idea. That's wild.
It is.
But he did it because of this knightly chivalric.
Yeah, which the French French had very much...
they kind of cornered the market on the whole thing, right? Like, this is the time of Chrétien de Troyes and the Knights of the Round Table and, Arthur and Guinevere and all of these wonderful stories that we all know that, they took it... I didn't realize they took it that seriously, but honestly, I thought it was just about, your valor on the battlefield. And I guess that extends to all aspects of your life.
I mean, it didn't for some people, but some people did. And
that's insane. It's
insane that you would voluntarily turn yourself in as a prisoner, and it's crazy.
So can we talk about just briefly, the longbow has always really interested me because it is such an innovation in terms of military weaponry. Yeah. And I did watch a very extensive documentary just about the longbow.
Oh, well then, Lindsay, share.
Well, and I don't have specifics, but it's just the fact that you could have, they had crossbows, which took very, up to a minute maybe to load, which is totally impractical when you're being faced down with, by French knights on horseback. Yeah. They had short bows, which I think were... They couldn't even pierce through anything. Yeah. They just did not have the power.
If you were unarmored entirely, exactly. It would hurt. But
a knight in full metal or chainmail, you were doing no damage there. But these longbows were something of a huge. It's like the equivalent of, I don't know, a tank or something.
Well, or like a machine gun. Changing World War I. They weren't ready for the machine guns to just mow people down.
Exactly. And that's what they could do and they had such distance and these strong English trees that they would be chopping down, and then people spending years, this was their only job. And I've actually heard of archaeological excavations where they find bones and they can tell just from looking at the bones. Yeah. One shoulder blade, the bone itself is twice the size, maybe not quite that much, but it's much larger than the other side because that's where they would hook that's what they were using to pull. So the bone grew as the muscle grew. This is how insane these guys were. This is what they did. Yep. These northern Englishmen who were just, firing off longbows day after day after day. Yep. And the range they could pierce through armor. And you didn't need a mounted...
dozen of them, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. And you didn't need a mounted contingency to mow down.
Or even to carry your ammunition or anything like that. It's much safer than, a knight who needs a horse for his armor and a horse for his huge lance that he carried. There's too much stuff for one animal to carry, whereas an archer could carry most of what he needed on his back and just drop most of it
and then be relatively safe, I guess, because you could be far away and firing that distance. It just decimated the French during the 100 Years' War and was one of the main reasons why Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were so decisive English victories was because of innovations like the longbow. I just think that's, I'm not much of a military historian or a military fan, but I think that's just really interesting to see how one tiny little innovation. I guess that's how people are going to look at the machine gun or something when it comes to World War I.
Yeah, it's true. But it is very noteworthy. Of course, the other thing that killed a lot of people in this time period was not the battles. It was the Black Death.
Oh, yes, 1347, right?
1347, right smack dab basically at the start of the war, in reality. Lasted for about 4 years, the really bad portion of it. Up to half of France and England died, potentially even more. Yeah. There's no super great records of the time period.
Yeah, because they just see a dead body and they throw it in a grave because they don't want to catch whatever the dead body has. So no one's keeping track of how many family members are dying.
Exactly. And a lot of the literate people were also dying. And there weren't many of them. So there were a lot of problems in this time period, but that was a huge one because it fundamentally changed not just how the war would happen, but how the economics of preparing and going to this war would occur. Because Edward III, when he started off, he was able to raise taxes and push the peasantry really hard to support his war. And when he came back with plunder, they were all like, yeah, let's go for it. This is the only thing I've got going in my life is perhaps the opportunity to get some fine French materials on a war. But after the plague, the not the purchasing power, the labor power of
Right.
your average everyday peasant went through the roof because there was so much untilled land to look after,
And so
they
few
could,
people left to do it.
well, if they could. I mean, the problem was this was also pushing against the whole idea of peasants owing service to their lord, which is tied to the land. Whereas if there's more profitable land over yonder to farm, nowadays you would go. I'm going to take up my plow and go.
Well, and this is what leads into the Peasants' Revolt that we talked about in the Wars of the Roses, Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt, which dramatically shook the foundations of English society.
Yeah.
But yeah, so obviously the Black Death has
exactly
effects for everything.
And it was kind of delayed because again, this is the end of the medieval period where those ties were the entire structure of society at that point was you owe your lord service and that lord will in turn protect you.
Right.
That was the whole relationship of everyone from the top down.
Yeah.
That started to fall apart militarily fairly soon into the war.
Right.
And it fell apart economically basically after the Black Death.
Yeah.
And then the social impacts followed, but it took a long time because the religious belief and just the everyday belief of everybody involved was that this is how the world is structured. So it took a while for them to realize, well, no, I can go make more money over there and you guys be damned. And it took until the population recovered, which took, over 100 years. Anyways, the tide turned after Agincourt, after Henry V, decimated the French once again in a huge battle. And then the French started winning battles starting about 1420s, 1426 or so, as Henry VI was on the throne, not doing much of anything.
He was a baby. Cut him some slack.
But even when he wasn't a baby, he gave up so much of France.
True.
They lost battles at Orleans, which was in Henry VI Part 1, Castillon. There were a bunch of other battles, especially through the north. They retook Normandy. At one point, a generation of Normans had grown up under English reign. It had been about 20, 25 years since England took back Normandy. I think that was under Henry IV. I believe so. It might have been Richard. No, it was probably Henry IV. And then all of a sudden France took it back again, and all these people were like, I'm English, kind of. I mean, because they were Normans still. This wasn't an era of huge nationalism. We'll get to the nationalism. There were some fans being flamed there too. So yes, eventually
flames being fanned.
Did I say fans being flamed?
Yep. Wow. But that works too. I like it. Fans being flamed. It's an Aidenism.
Yeah, I do that on occasion.
Snaps like butter.
It snaps like butter, and the French win the war.
Yes.
About 1453 is considered the last date when they finally push the English off to everything except for Calais, which they do eventually lose later on too.
The thing about the nationalism, can we come back to that really briefly? Because it seems like the two main things that come out of, I guess two main things. A new tax structure and the idea of taxes being collected for standing armies and things like what we now concede to social services and stuff like that all kind of had their roots in this period. But also the sense of national pride and nationalism, which has a bad rap today because of things that have happened in modern day. Nationalism does not have the greatest reputation. But at the time, it was this sense of pride in a country that you came from, which England had to a degree, but France certainly didn't. France was mostly these little provinces that kind of all came together as vassal states to, paying allegiance or owing allegiance to the king. But winning all these wars and coming together, it seems to have galvanized the nation of France, and it did the same for England, especially these big battles. And that's why Henry V winning at Agincourt in 1415 is so critical part of English history, because it was a major English victory. And I almost draw the comparison to like the War of 1812 for Canada and the United States and how it kind of created us as countries, because it
separated us from them. Right. And that's what wars inevitably force you to do, right?
Exactly.
There's an us, there's a them.
Yeah. And it's no longer about being, upper Canada, lower Canada. It's like, no, we're fighting against the Americans. Yeah. So now we are all Canadians. Yeah. And that seems to be what happened here.
Absolutely.
Correct me if I'm wrong?
Nope, that's exactly it. And you see that in in a lot of the Shakespearean plays, the title of the character is the most important thing, right? It's the Duke
Normandy.
of Gloucester. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Lancaster, York. It's not just a statement of title, although it does serve that purpose, but it's also a sense of location, of source, of
This
where
person
you're
is from the north. This person is from
where your power comes from, where your upbringing is located. All those elements kind of play into it. And it was it's much more pronounced in France of the two countries that were at war. France had a habit of gifting titles and lands that were very closely together. So the Duke of Poitou, or the Count of Poitou, most of his lands would be in the Poitou area, whereas the Duke of York could have lands in York and then down in Lancashire and down in the Southlands and even in Dorset or something like they could be anywhere in the in the country of England. And so for the English monarchs, the English nobles, they would tend to have a location that was their home, but then they could have lands all over the country.
They were already feeling a little bit more nationalistic. Like this is
they
all
had
my land.
A larger sense of at least they'd seen more likely more of the country than in France.
Whereas in France, it was very much you stay within 25 miles of where your lands, your
titled most likely
lands
until you
are.
Go to war to kind of get more land. Basically, is how that would work.
Okay.
And so that you mentioned the taxes and how that kind of interacted there was kind of interesting because generally it was. In England, we always kind of think of Parliament granting the right for the king to raise money for an army and
usually that would be the only reason they would do that was to raise money for
they didn't
war.
Raise taxes on.
Well, unless the king's coffers were low, then he might ask Parliament. For money,
if he needed something, but I mean, it was generally not frowned upon, or it was frowned upon to raise taxes at all. Yeah, unless there was a specific purpose, and the French, meanwhile, because they had those many kind of kingdoms within one another, they were a little more free with raising their taxes for their own purposes. So a Duke of Burgundy, for instance, who is a major player and winds up tilting the balance of power in the war
one
in the
way
later
or the
years.
other, many times.
Exactly. He would have no problem raising his own army for his own purposes, for that exact purpose. So
then the people who lived within the Duchy of Burgundy would be paying higher taxes than Aquitaine or wherever. And it would serve their own kind of local purpose, whereas Parliament would raise it for a national army. Right.
So, and that kind of backed off, it went back and forth, and actually towards the end, it's actually France who had the most centralized states in the end. They'd started because the king of France, when he took back a lot of the land, claimed a lot of it for himself.
Okay.
And so he would just get rid of the English nobles and keep a lot of the land, and then he used it directly to raise money for things like the standing army, which was actually the first. France was the first one by the end of the war, the first country in Europe to have a standing army.
A French standing army
that reported directly to the king.
Because England at that point was still having, lords or whoever raising armies from the people who lived in that area to bring to national.
A little bit. Let's jump over there, Lindsay, because what was happening in England was a little different. Because you think that's exactly how it would work. Your lord calls on you to come fight, and at the start of the war, that's close to how it was. There was. The reason they had so many good archers was because every peasant was supposed to spend, I don't know, half of a Sunday or something once a week. They were supposed to practice their archery skills.
Really?
So every man who was, and boy, from like the age of 12 till they could basically no longer hold a bow, would practice every day. So when they were called up for the army in those early battles, they were basically a trained fighting force. Yeah.
Wow.
And they were fairly cheap in comparison to the French, which is important, and this is just a side tangent, but the population of England at the start of the war is about 6 million, or is it 3 million, and the French was 20 million. In any case, it's like 5 times bigger.
Holy shit.
Yeah, France was massively, much more economically developed and much just richer because of that country. Their farmlands were much more developed. There's a lot of forestry still or forested land in England.
Well, they were the top tier, next to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Really, the French kings looked at themselves as those were their peers,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, yeah.
So I mean, and the country itself has still to this day, I mean, wineries, and there's all kind of cheese, and there's all kinds of things. Whereas England at the time, I think wool was their main export.
That was number one.
And they dealt mostly with the Flemish, who were kind of in the pocket of the French. Yeah. So I mean, their limited growth was kind of hampering them a lot in that regard too.
Yeah, and they did produce an excess of food. There was a surplus of. They traded food in a lot of cases for wine and French goods and stuff up to that point. But yeah, they were not the breadbasket of Europe by any means. So in these early years, it was basically still a medieval system of the peasants come up to serve in the army when called upon. And that died away pretty quickly after the Black Death because the peasants needed to stay on the land just to keep everyone fed and alive. And there wasn't much taxes to be raised. So what happened was the English moved to a system called indenturing.
Indenturating.
Yes, indentured.
You were an indentured servant?
Yes, basically is what it is.
Indentured servitude.
So this was a slightly different system in that the nobles who would normally call upon their direct peasants were instead told to just recruit anybody.
Okay.
Find the people, you pay for them. Mm-hmm. You get the money however you want to pay for these people, and they will be your soldiers. So it was kind of like a semi-pro army.
Okay.
In the sense that...
It's AAA.
Yeah, it's AAA.
Not NBA, not professional.
No. These are junior leaguers, but they're coming on up because... what could happen was you could serve the Duke of York 1 year, and then when he was done with his warring and maybe it wasn't profitable and he could barely afford to pay you or he didn't pay you, the next year you could go on and serve with the Count of Oxford as he went pillaging through France. And so you could go from one war to another, and it created kind of like a mercenary class within English society. And so they kind of had the benefit of these veteran soldiers sticking around from one campaign to the next.
Gotcha.
And some of them, there was a good couple stories in the book I did read called where a guy would go there and then he would go fight for the Teutonic Order to try and pacify the Slavs in the East. And then he would go fight against the Turks in a crusade. Yeah.
Wow.
And then he'd wind up coming back to England and fighting in France. And this kind of brings us to one of the more interesting aspects of this from an English historical perspective, which is that the English soldiers and nobility had no money. They were, again, very poor in comparison to France. Yeah. But because they were the dominant military power in the war, the French largely avoided fighting them for basically like 60 some years.
After the war?
No,
or
during the middle of the war, there was a whole period from after, not Crécy, what was the...
Agincourt?
No, Poitiers. Poitiers, after they captured King John, basically the French just didn't want to fight anymore.
How do you fight a massive war, but don't fight one another?
Exactly, and that's the problem is because the English started this thing called the chevauchée.
Okay. Oh, I'm in for this. I like new words.
So the chevauchée was basically the raping and pillaging of northern France.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, I know what that is.
So
brilliant.
It was terribly, terribly brutal. I mean, it was basically just a reign of absolute terror. They would literally just kill all the men, rape all the women. There were instances of killing children or burning whole towns alive. They'd give everyone in a church and burn it down. Like, it's massively terrible, terrible things that they were doing.
The English doing this in northern France.
Yeah, well, all through France, but especially in northern France took the brunt of it in a lot of cases. And they would pillage everything. So literally, food was the biggest one. They would come in harvest season, kill all the peasants and take all their food back to England because England couldn't feed itself for periods because of the Black Death. But mostly they would take anything that had value and was portable. So like gems, clothing, weapons, statues, like anything that, like you could find it anywhere in France. You could find it in England because the soldiers had gone and taken it from France and brought it back.
Wow.
And it's kind of really crazy because this kind of became a cottage industry in England. It was they were the soldiers whose entire livelihood was made by getting paid by a noble to go into France and kill people, and then hauling back any booty you could get and selling it in England.
Selling it to whomever would pay.
Yeah. And so it's a strange economic system because it doesn't actually lead to England getting much richer per se, because the fundamentals are there that they don't have enough people to do the jobs that would make them rich, and the economic base has not grown, Lindsay, to support this.
Thank you for that.
So they've just
with your hands. God, I wish you guys could see this.
So they've just basically been stealing the finished goods without taking any of the know-how to build these things themselves, or having the industry or the natural resources in England to actually produce fine furs or something like that.
So it's not dramatically changing their station in life, but it's tilting the balance of power in a war that. Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting.
It's an interesting interesting switch.
And that all changes after Agincourt.
Well, no, before Agincourt, it's between Poitiers and Agincourt. Kind of is in this period of, it's the Richard II. He would, when he did go to France, he didn't go to France very much because they were dealing with the Black Plague and the fallout of that still. When Henry IV would initially go through France, or he'd send his captains. Right. A lot of the time it was not the king leading an army anymore. It was very much just
send your top guys.
Send a duke with 10 captains and 1,000 soldiers, and they would just ravage the land. So this kind of period in there, this is when the chevauchée, I'm sure I'm also pronouncing that, and I don't know where the etymology of that one. It sounds like the anti-chivalric code, because that's basically what it was. I mean, and now we'll jump off a sidetrack here of saying this was a major changing point for moral norms in England, especially because they basically did become like a terrorist organization. Yes. The whole point of the chevauchée was to try and reduce the hold of France, of the French monarch on the French lands. If your French lord can't protect you, maybe you should be English after all.
So was there a chance that the English could land in a city and they'd be like, oh, hold on, you know what? We'll be English. We'll bend the knee as it is,
yes,
as it was.
It did happen quite often. The other thing was if there was a French garrison protecting a city, especially, and the English had already plundered enough booty, they just say, oh, well, we'll just pay you to let us in, and so we can kill everybody.
Oh, wow.
Like, it happened in all sorts of machinations. It was a very, very terrible time.
Well, and it's long before we have any kind of, the Hague councils and courts and war crimes. I mean, Henry V famously killed a bunch of French prisoners of war, which was considered pretty awful. And Shakespeare writes about that in Henry V. So, exactly. I mean, I think even that, the fact that filters up into the literature, which was trying to espouse a kind of ideal for, maybe not an ideal, but a
cleaner
lineage.
Version.
Well, yeah,
of
and to kind of explain, like, we've earned the reign of Gloriana, and the fight against the Spanish Armada is our birthright, because look at where we've come. We defeated the French, for Christ's sake, right? But having said that, we also did some shitty shit. We killed a bunch of French prisoners. Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that filters up says something that it had to have been pretty brutal, and for it to have
and it's
come
odd
into the
because,
propaganda.
I mean, the idea of chivalry is that you treat people well when they're prisoners, but it only really applied to nobles. So all this murdering of peasants, I guess, really didn't factor in. But when I was reading the history period, the sacrificing of Henry V's prisoners to ensure they didn't riot and kill him later on seems like a small deal compared to, there were instances of like towns of 2,000 people being killed, like 5 of those towns in a year, right? So what do a couple soldiers matter? Like it's just an odd, it's an odd shift away from the Middle Ages again, right? Where you could countenance killing these prisoners who are Christian, and they're good people, and they're probably related to you in some way, and you can kill them anyways and not face like a revolution or an uprising or anything like this, because unlike King John II, you're not going to turn yourself in. If Henry V had been captured, this is 60 years after John II had returned to England to be ransomed again.
French John.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, sorry. The French king had returned to be ransomed again. I don't see Henry V doing that if he's captured and then escapes. that shift has already kind of happened in terms of the morality of what's acceptable during warfare. And I think the chevauchée had a lot to do with it, because it really laid a very low baseline for acceptable behavior in warfare.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say I kind of wish we stuck with the Chevalier, but I mean, at least we do have the Geneva Conventions today, but
which is kind of based on chivalric code, right?
Yes.
Like, don't treat people like crap.
Yeah.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
So, and the way this ties back into nationalism and the economy and all these things is that it's a strange system, the chevauchée, to discuss. It's basically total war. I mean, it feels like it wouldn't be unheard of in World War II. You know, the Nazis invaded Russia and they just slaughtered everybody and took all their food and instigated, mass starvation and stuff. It's very similar, but there was no scope to actually fight back in a total war sense. It was still kind of bound by the chivalric code of knights and fair fights and so on and so forth, but with this seedy underbelly of reality of just being terrible to everybody, especially to the peasantry. And so I kind of, this bugged me throughout the whole history. And perhaps if I'd read perhaps the 4-volume, 2,400 page masterpiece, I might have a better answer. But I kind of wondered why there was so little movement in the French side. I mean, here's the thing about the French side that we don't talk about very much in England, because it's not really relevant for Shakespeare, at least. They were kind of undergoing their own civil war at this time.
Oh, okay.
The Burgundians, who the Duke of Burgundy leads, and the Armagnacs were two very huge forces fighting against each other. And it's kind of like the English threat was, and all the pillaging and everything was just kind of like a side battle to their larger dynastic feud between who should be the next Valois, which I think also came about after.
It's kind of like the opposite of the Wars of the Roses being like a smaller battle in the larger 100 Years' War.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. This was kind of the side piece for them, and it really took until they lost. Until Henry V came in and kicked everybody's butt and took over so much land of France, and eventually took over the crown, that they kind of realized, oh, okay, this is a problem, because Henry V had played the Burgundians against the Armagnacs to get the Duke of Burgundy to help him take over the throne. Yeah. So I wanted to wheel that back quickly to say that it's kind of interesting that France didn't do more to prepare their own peasants to protect themselves, in a sense. I was kind of wondering, like, well, why didn't the French just learn how to train their peasants in archery too? Or, why did they not learn how to make longbows from Italian trees or wherever they could have gotten the raw materials, right? And maybe they couldn't have, and that was just where it ended. But it took a while for France to adapt and find something that would beat the English longbow, which was eventually gunpowder. And the big battle where I think it was might have actually been the battle where Talbot from Henry VI Part 1 actually died, was the first major use of gunpowder weapons by France.
Really?
It was actually the English storming a castle, and France had these these terrible little like pistols, I guess you would call them, but they're basically just a stick with a bullet inside and some gunpowder shoved in there, and they just put a lit match onto a hole, exploded out, and you were just carrying this stick around with gunpowder and a bullet and a lit thing, just walking around.
Like a Roman candle.
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
But it was extremely effective against the English charging this castle, and they just completely wiped out the English. And that was kind of the turning point. It was this major technological change that
kind of like
France
the longbow did.
Exactly. It came back around.
Roman candles.
Yeah, exactly. And the French were also better with their cannons and so forth. So it was this switch that came back around and eventually captured them. But it took 70 years of getting their ass kicked basically for this
to smarten up and say, hey, maybe we should innovate a bit.
Yeah.
Instead of doing the same thing and expecting different results. But they did have Joan of Arc in the middle of all of this, too.
They did have Joan of Arc.
We haven't talked about Joan of Arc at all.
Nope.
Do you want to briefly touch on the historical Joan of Arc? Did your book go into any of it? Or?
I mean, it was very much, it was a little dismissive of her contribution, except for, she was a big morale raiser.
Yeah.
But the historical record seemed to be that nobody really treated her all that well, and nobody really believed that she was, except for her. But when she started, inspiring troops to win a few battles, they were all for it. And they kind of let her go and die really poorly.
Yeah.
So she did have a large effect on improving the morale of the French once they'd kind of rallied around the Dauphin, who should have been the rightful heir if Henry V had not taken the crown from him, or from his father. So and that's eventually how they did win the war, was through her contributions, and then that Dauphin, I don't remember his name now. I don't remember if he was crowned as Charles something or Louis.
I think he was eventually, but it was a while later. But like Joan of Arc, and we touched on it a bit during the Henry VI Part 1. But she's this mythical figure. She really does stand and loom large in the French legend, and she's very much poo-pooed in the English tradition. So, I mean, growing up in English Canada, we didn't learn a lot about Joan of Arc, but my colleagues who went through the Francophone system here in Alberta think Joan of Arc is just the bee's knees. And so it just goes to show how these stories that are told very differently depending on where you are. And I think that's why it's important for us to get into these histories a little bit, because we're getting an English propagandist view of the history of these English wars with France and so forth, so on and so forth. So to actually pick it apart, and at some point it would be nice to kind of do a little bit more about these individual characters like Joan of Arc, but I mean, as it is, I think it's just important to recognize that there are two sides to this. And I learned some things already about like the French dynastic battles between, what'd you say, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Yeah. So, it sounds like there's a lot more similarities between the English and the French, which doesn't surprise me at all, considering the fact that the French and the English were so closely, very incestual across the channel there.
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing we didn't touch on, but there was a lot of intermarrying between the two royal families. Course. I mean, like, at some point, Henry VI, by some measures, was the rightful king of France. And it didn't matter, because he lost the military battle, and that was the end of it.
And that's interesting, too, that it becomes less about who you are and who you're related to, and it's more about which army you're commanding.
Yeah, the realities on the battlefield.
Exactly. So kings, and again, because of the Wars of the Roses, we've talked about this a bit, kings were being decided on battlefields. And you have people like Warwick, the kingmaker, who can make a king out of just a random nobleman. Yeah. Well, maybe not a random nobleman, but for sure. But I mean, I think if you had him in your corner, you'd be fairly confident that you would end up on the throne. So it becomes less and less important who you are and what your lineage is.
Which is already a huge step away from the medieval period.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to touch on that, another kind of disintegration that I kind of mentioned was, and you'd actually mentioned it, Lindsay, but I mentioned it in our first overview period, was that the kind of Renaissance era of England was when the wool trade really started going. But it was actually, you were right, when I was reading the book, they said wool was already England's number one export, and a huge driver of their economy was sending wool from there to the Low Countries.
Yes.
So I mean that's kind of it had only gained strength through the early modern period. But it was, again, a free trade kind of economy did not exist prior to in the modern imagination. The medieval economy is purely agrarian. There's no trade. There's nothing like that. But it was already starting to take root. And so that's kind of another way of looking at this time period, is kind of stretching the boundaries between those two eras, and saying that, both of them kind of intersect
and then they lead into some interesting things in the later modern period with early modern, later. I know that's not a real term.
The early later modern,
middle modern, with the Dutch East India Company and their trade and the things that happened later on in the 17th century. I think the seeds of that, at least insofar as England is concerned, are being laid in this period. Yeah. And then growing that merchant class is what really triggers the start of the English Renaissance, which again happened quite a bit later than Renaissance on the continent, but happened nonetheless. So we're really in the middle of the Renaissance period when Shakespeare is writing these, but it's already well underway, almost over in the rest of Europe.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
Yeah.
Why then the world's mine oyster, which I with sword will open.
So just to briefly kind of bring it back to Shakespeare quickly, how does this history kind of impact his plays? I think we actually probably dealt with the play that deals with it the most, which is Henry VI, Part 1. Other plays that we're coming up on too that will deal with it, Henry IV.
Henry V.
Henry V obviously will
Richard II.
Probably be the most.
Eventually.
Well, and that's the thing, because I wanted to talk about it because those other plays, despite being set in the middle of the 100 Years' War, don't have much to do with French politics.
Right.
At all. It is very much focused on the internal rivalries and so forth. And I think that's interesting because the 100 Years' War, again, it's kind of this concept, but it falls apart because it was not a continuous war.
No.
Richard II did very little campaigning in France. Henry IV did a fair bit more, but again, it was not the focus of their reign. It was an economic tool almost for their country, and it's kind of represented as such in Shakespeare.
Well, and I think also the idea that, I mean, Henry VI Part 2 was the first play that Shakespeare wrote in that trilogy of Henry VI plays. Yeah. But these were early plays, and so he was a young playwright and a relatively inexperienced playwright, I would say. As we know from reading these early plays, they're not the most well-developed. No. So, let's put some battle scenes on stage, right? Let's go whole hog into the battles of the 100 Years' War. Whereas later on, when you become a more sophisticated writer, you can have internal squabbles and you can have court intrigue be the focus of your play, and have it carry as much, if not more weight than a battle scene that you can't even really accurately depict, as we know, because Part 1 of the Henry VI trilogy is abominable when it comes to the battle scenes. Stage, so that could also be why we're seeing, I'm sure that a more sophisticated playwright could have taken the story of Henry VI or any of the French noblemen fighting in that, or Joan of Arc herself, and turned it into a Richard III court intrigue type play. With the right tools and the right language and the ability and skills as a writer. Shakespeare just didn't have that at the time. So maybe that's another reason why we see this focus on wars and fighting and battles early on. Once we get, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe once we get to those later plays
we'll
in this.
See more. I mean, I've read Richard II, and it's not focused on France. We've read Henry IV Part 1, I believe, and it's also not focused. Although there is still war there, and it's still
there, but it's like the tapestry behind the scenes. It's like what's happening in the background, but there's all this other stuff that's happening in the foreground, which is much more interesting. So I mean, this is going to be an interesting one. I was not looking forward to the history plays. I'm not going to lie to you.
I know,
but it's turning into something a little bit more interesting when you look at it, and in the broad context of Shakespeare's work. I think that it's going to bear some interesting fruit.
And the other piece of fruit that I neglected to mention it when you were talking about nationalism. This is the birth of the English language in this time period too. Right. Chaucer was around during the reign of Edward III. He was probably a soldier he was actually captured in one of the battles and ransomed. Yep.
Wow.
So he firsthand saw part of this war, especially probably the early part. And that was, and this breakdown into them versus us helped form the language that Shakespeare eventually inherited.
Right.
Even with its many French loanwords and, chevauché itself obviously being a French word, it helped to define what England became by Shakespeare's time.
That is so cool because language is one of those galvanizing features of anything. If you speak the same language, I was talking about it with some coworkers the other day, that's where whenever you're in another country, you gravitate towards the areas. If you live in another country for a period of time, you gravitate to the areas where the expats are, right? Because language centers you, grounds you, it makes you feel home. If you don't know how to communicate with somebody else, it's not. So to have the English language being born out of this like the modern English language, right? Yeah. And Chaucer was writing in the Middle English period, but it comes into full flower during his time. Because of a war. If it's kind of like, I think that there's awful things about war, and war is never something that you want to enter into, but it created something that was now, English being this language that...
Yeah, a little anecdote from our Chaucer class. There was a competing poet with Chaucer in this time period. And he wrote his poems in 3 languages, in Latin, in French, and then in English, because he couldn't decide which language was going to come out on top.
Right.
So he basically wanted to last for posterity, so he wrote them all in 3 languages. Chaucer just said English. Fuck it. I fought those French bastards. I'm writing in that language anymore. And it had a huge impact. And the nobles all flocked to it, and they said, this is how we're going to define who we are versus the French. We're not going to speak their language anymore. Although not that France was a homogeneous language group or anything at this point.
And English wasn't either, but it starts to become that in the time of Chaucer, and then with the Great Vowel Shift, you get more and more centralized. It becomes the English that's spoken in London more than anything. So that's already starting to happen, where you're kind of losing some of the dialectical markers in words themselves that mark you off as being from the north or the south or whatever.
Yeah. So by the time of Henry V, he was probably actually speaking English in Agincourt, whereas Edward III was probably still speaking French to his troops and so forth. But Henry was an English king. Yeah. Yes. So when we read the English king proclaiming, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he may have said something close.
Yeah. Very cool.
All I have, he has eaten me out of house and home.
So we still don't have a name for this.
No, we did. What was it the last episode?
Marriage counseling? No, that was the first one. That was terrible. This one's a fun one, though. Yeah. Lindsay, we've spent a month in each capital. England or France? Paris or London? Which one do you prefer? Go.
Which city?
Which city
Oh, Jesus.
do you love more?
Oh, my God.
Say it right now for all of the world to hear.
I have to say London.
Okay.
London is my city. London, I have fond memories of taking my Oyster card and getting lost on the tube and coming up out of a train station and finding myself in some neighborhood and just being able to get lost. We did that a little bit in Paris, I will admit.
A fair bit in Paris.
But London is it for me. 1000% London.
And I just have to disagree so much. Paris is
I knew you were going to say that.
Such a beautiful city. You don't even have to speak French to enjoy Paris. You can just walk through the streets anytime, winter, summer, fall. It's all beautiful. Mm-hmm. The art, the culture, everything there is incredible, and it wins in my heart every time. Sorry, Liz.
Well, I guess we have to divorce now. Does that what this mean?
No, we'll just get 2 homes, and then we can just take the channel between back and forth when we want to visit each other. Yeah.
With what buttons or good looks? How are you going to pay for this?
We won't. We won't afford it, but we can do it for a couple months probably.
Sure, let's try. That'll be fun. After the podcast is over.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Have it be coward!
And that's it for this episode.
Yeah, thank you, teacher, Mr. Hales. That was an excellent lesson.
You're welcome, pupil Lindsay Stamhuse. I'm sorry, I was probably rambling on a little bit too much there, but I'm glad you asked some very good questions.
I asked pointed questions because I knew where I wanted to lead the conversation. Because as any good student, you want to get your teacher off track, right?
That's right.
So you resisted me admirably. Maybe you should have my job.
I don't think so. But thank you for joining us. Next episode will be our continuation of the history plays.
Yes, Henry VI, Part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2.
Yeah, that should be fun.
Part the second.
Part the second.
You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast fix.
If you want to tell us what you think of Shakespeare, his plays, poems, or any of the topics we discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, that's @TheBixPod,
on Facebook at facebook.com/TheBixPod, or by email at thebixpod@gmail.com. That's our cue to